I know you'll find it hard to believe, but in the early 1900s, one of the most respected archaeologists in the world looked at the evidence coming out of Egypt, which they'd been gathering for a long time, and concluded that the people that built that civilization hadn't or couldn't have done it themselves. That outsiders, someone from outside of the African continent, they must have swept in at some point in time and brought in the architecture and the writing and the religion. And that guy was Sir Flinders Petrie, a founding figure of scientific Egyptology for decades, decades, super respected in the top of the field. And that was the mainstream view that we had all through, even when I was growing up. But 50 years later, a young man from Senegal with the last name Diop, Cheikh Anta Diop, I believe it is. Anyway, he came in out of the blue and started proposing something completely the opposite. And he stood in front of the Sorbonne in France and said, what? That Egypt was built by Black Africans in full, on their own. No Europeans came in to show them how to do it, that they did this on their own. So two completely different, opposite starting points, both claiming to be reading the exact same evidence. That evidence has been coming since really from time of Napoleon. They've been digging up in Egypt for a long time. And I want to show you in a real way just how long and how hard it was for Diop to finally persevere almost his whole lifetime and have the world opinion, at least the scholarly world opinion, start to change and start to shift. He spent almost, his entire life trying to convince the white guys, trying to convince the Europeans and all the different Egyptologists of his case. Because these are people who had, for years, 100 years plus, they had either believed themselves or been taught to believe what this first guy said, the racist kind of thing about Africa. So they believe there's no way that this Diop guy, he's out of his tree, there's no way that this 27-year-old man could make his case before them. And it's not like they just wouldn't believe him. They wouldn't even sit and listen to him at all. They had no interest in even hearing his arguments. And it took another 14 years before a few Egyptologists started to even argue with him, acknowledge his claim, and start to go back and forth and argue with him about the issues. And I don't want to make you think that it happened overnight. It didn't. The colonial attitudes are super strong. They even are to our day. They really were in the 1900s, of course, and into our day even now. But the Egyptologists in the world were finally willing at least to argue with him and discuss it. And then it was more decades of discussion and this and that, until finally, in his own words, he was able to open an official UNESCO history of Africa. And even then, plenty of them still disagreed. It took another 2 more decades after that first opening, for his own words, to actually gain appeal, to get an official UNESCO history of Africa. And it took until his death. Remember, he started talking about this when he was about 27. So it took until his death in 1986 that the very institution that once refused to even seat him, to even listen to him, they put his name over the front gate. So the issue is here, they were both looking at the same evidence. The colonial powers and Petrie and those guys and Diop. And you go, okay, they were looking at the same evidence. I don't want to get into all the other rabbit holes that one could go down because there are tons of them. But look at how long it took just for the scholars to even come around to change their minds, or at least start to change their minds. I don't want this video to get into places that others like Kings Monologue and Trillblack and other channels cover so much better about Egypt. But I do think it's worth going over this man's life versus the colonial powers and how long it takes people to actually change their minds and look at things. Because as you know, I do videos on all kinds of things happening in Africa with the Bible and those kind of things. But do I think that most people that are Gentile Europeans or Americans are going to look at that and even give it any space to think about it? Probably not many. But among the Africans and the black Africans and people in other parts of the world, in the Philippines and everywhere else, no, not so much of a problem. But once people have the blinders on in a certain area, it's very difficult to open up. It was hard for these scholars with the actual facts in front of them for 40, 50 years to argue this until they finally had to acknowledge that he had a point. So after struggling and struggling and struggling, Diop finally published in 1954 a book called Nation Negre y Culture. I think that's the French, more or less. I'm good with Spanish. French is a little hard. The poet and statesman Aimé Césaire, who watched this unfold in real time, put it plainly years later. By giving Africa back its past, Cheikh Anta Diop may have given humanity back its past. So sit with that and think about that, what he actually said, and it's so true. I wouldn't be doing these videos about the beauty of Africa and the Bible in Africa and all those things if someone else hadn't already opened the door. Many people have opened the doors, and I've watched wonderful videos and other people that are doing great presentations. And then I have my own spin on things, but look back at the greatness of this man. Incredible, right? What he went through with the scientific community. And as we go through this video, I want to just think about it. You know, if anybody did a video even 20 years ago about Egypt and a black pharaoh, they wouldn't go to the movie. And I'm not even sure they would go today. Because just because some scholars came around, have we as a people come around? Not so much. So by giving Africa back its past, glorious past, and they've only touched on the surface, of course, because we haven't even gotten into Moreau and, you know, Great Zimbabwe and the other huge ruins in Africa, South Africa, all over the place. We haven't even gotten into that, but just rescuing, if you want, Egypt back into Africa, the continent it's in, and giving it back its African pharaohs, it gave humanity back its past. So instead of this Gentile European whitewash of history everywhere, the other third world nations, as we call them, or the global south, or the nations that are coming to the fore now as the West falls, they can gain back their history and the beauty of their people, and have their heart back and get back their story that has been stolen from them through the colonial period. And I think we tend to think that, oh yeah, the people just changed their minds, they just accepted it. No, he went back to Senegal, to his home nation, and was he accepted? Not really. It says that he faced real opposition there in his home, his home place in Africa. Because once even the Africans, and the North Americans and the Black Americans and all the people over the world, we have these blinders on. We don't even believe when it's our people being put to the fore. We won't even believe them because we believe this colonial lies and manipulation for so long that we don't even think about it anymore. And that to me is what this video is about. Learning to check the things that we've learned, the Babylon story against reality, and how hard it is for us. It's hard for me. I think it's hard for you. It's hard for everyone to start to see things as they might really be instead of what we've been taught. So his knocking on the door in Paris, even 9 years later, didn't matter. He still wasn't at home some celebrity that thank you for rescuing Africa and giving us back our name. And I only see that coming to the fore now in the last few years, where you're getting a lot of African presenters on YouTube and other places that are starting to take up these issues, which is wonderful. But I don't think any of them, probably, they might admit that themselves, I don't think any of them would have come up with the thought maybe on their own if it hadn't been for the work of Diop setting the ground, doing the grueling work which he did with his whole life. I want to bring out this point. It may not mean much for you, but this Diop, he went and had a lab in Dakar, and he built his own testing, his way of testing melanin dosage on mummified remains, because he had to come up with a rationale, a way of proving his argument that the pharaohs and a lot of the mummies, especially in the older period, not the Greek period of Egypt, but in the older dynasties, that there was a way of proving that these people, these mummies, were African. So he needed evidence, not just his word. It had to have some evidence. And that's where it gets really important, that as I'm doing these videos, let's say I just did one on Jerusalem, being possibly somewhere in some part of Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, some people say South Africa, Namibia, Congo, wherever. But if we're going to come up with a hard, fast facts, it can't be just we saw this on a map or we think it happened here, just like he had to. We actually have to get some actual facts in order to build a consensus. And then other than that, it's just a theory. But as I said, if colonial powers don't let you dig or don't give the money for any digs below Egypt, then it's very difficult to prove much of anything, is it not? You know, if something's buried 20, 30 feet under the ground and no one ever goes looks for it, well, of course, you're never going to find it. And we'll be stuck in the same position of just discussing things rather than get to work digging things up. In 1974, 23 years after his first thesis was rejected, Diop and fellow scholar Théophile Obenga finally got the room that they've been fighting for his whole career. And they got a symposium in Cairo to discuss with Egyptologists from around the world. And so no matter what you hear online, think about what really happened and go read for yourself. But it wasn't just a clean, hey, great, thanks for coming, guys, and thanks for showing us your proof and all that. No, it was huge arguments, tons of pushback. There was almost no agreement with what they had to say. So it generated real heated debates, heated arguments. And it wasn't like they all went home in harmony. We're all in harmony with not at all. His position that Egypt and Egyptians remained dark-skinned, melanated people all the way up until independence was lost was directly challenged by a number of the other major scholars who were there present. And this is only in 1974. Even in 1984, when this is published, some of his work in UNESCO's General History of Africa, it says even then the arguments in that chapter of Diop's, had not been accepted by experts, all the experts I should say, in the world on the question that he brought up. So what in my mind was his major accomplishment? Of course it's what he did for Africans and for Egypt and Egyptology. But what's his real accomplishment? And that's probably why I personally loved that story, is that he could have given up when he was 27 or 37 or 45. He couldn't have given up all the way through. But he spent his life, with a dog at the bone. He felt, it was his life work. I don't know. I'd have to read some more. But just look at what he did. He did not give up. He felt that he was in the right and the rest of the world in Egyptology were wrong. But one lone voice. But without doing the work that he did to prove his theories with actual facts, I don't know, we'd probably be in the same place now as he was then, because it's only 30 years on from there now, more or less. So look at how slow things change and the amount of proof and the fighting and backbiting and politics that goes into science, Science is supposed to be, we just look at the facts, judge them, and move on. And you can see that that's absolutely so far from the truth, I love bringing up with people about flat earth, right? It doesn't matter in one way or another to me, but you bring it up and it's just like, whoa, exploding heads, right? But almost anything that is not even people, it's not a matter of whether you could bring in the facts and you could take a person out and show them that the world is flat or the world is a globe. But let's say the world is flat for this. Doesn't matter. You could show them the proofs and be like, no, you got it wrong. There must be some detail wrong. So science, in some ways, is a religion as well. Absolutely. And people hold on to it just as much faith in the science as they do in their own religion. You look at these Egyptologists, they all probably came from different religions, some Muslim, some Catholic, some Protestant. And how long did it take them to come around to what was a reality that Diop said, which is true, that the African pharaohs were African. And they were black, African, and they weren't, white Europeans. But how long did that take to come about? His whole lifetime. And has it come around in the movies and the theaters and the paintings? Just go online, anywhere, and bring up a picture, ask for a picture on YouTube or a picture on Google or any search engine and go, look, I want pictures of I want pictures of Ramses, or I want pictures of Moses, or I want pictures of anything, anybody, whether it's Bible or Egypt. Look it up, and what will you find? Europeans dressed sometimes as Egyptians, or Europeans dressed as Middle Eastern people. But do you find even many Middle Eastern looking people? Not really. And do you find any African stuff? Hardly at all, which is why I tend to have to use AI for a lot of my videos, because I can't get, there are no pictures. People ask me, why don't you get pictures of, I'm going like, there aren't any pictures, you know. It's like, you go look it up, I'm sure you have, but just go look it up, it's mind-bending. But the reality is it took that long for the scientific world to come around. But just because the scientific world has sort of come around slowly, they still aren't there yet at all. But have the regular people like you and me, unless you're looking into these things, 99 or 98% of the people, if you ask them in America or China or anywhere else, you know, were the Pharaohs white or black or European or Mediterranean, what would they say? Mediterranean, because that's what they've been taught. It's very hard to get these things changed, even among the scholars. So Cheikh Anta Diop died in Dakar in Senegal on February 7th, 1986. 2 years after the UNESCO chapter was finally published, with all the caveats and all that. 35 years after that first closed door in Paris. The same university system that once refused to even have people even listen to him, after his death, renamed in his honor Université Cheikh Anta Diop de Dakar. And so it's just fascinating how long it took. We're talking scholars that are supposed to be scientists, right? And they have the evidence in front of them. But for whatever reason, I don't want to get into conspiracy theory, but for whatever reason, they did not want to change their mind. They had seen the ruins, they saw the paintings, they saw the walls, they saw the same artifacts, but their, thing made it so they could not see or even admit it, because to admit it would be changing everything about what they believed and studied and published. Very difficult. And the issue is there still isn't a consensus. He lived to see just the start, but there's still, even today, there is no consensus in that community of the Egyptologists. And the Arab, especially among the Arab people, they don't really want the ancient Egypt being turned into a part of Black Africa. They resent that, and makes them feel like it's not their country, I suppose. But to understand this with Diop, and that it isn't just because he was black, and the African issue, which of course is there and all that, no doubt about it, made it even worse. But think about these things, right? But the pit down man and the continental drift, one a geological theory and one a man that was found in a swamp. But how long it took for the consensus to change on these figures. Because in 1912, a skull was found in England, and it was announced as the missing link between apes and humans, the pit down man. And it was accepted, it was taught, and it was cited by the scientific establishment for over 40 years, until in 1953, it was exposed as a deliberate forgery. Okay, so when we bow down to science, I don't care what it is, just look at the little, thing that just went by. When we bow down to science, we pay the price, because scientists can't even agree on things and not be fooled themselves for that long a period of time. And they published it, they believed it, they wrote about it. It was a religion, it is the way it is. And yet it turned out to be a fraud. Also in 1912, a man named Alfred Wegener, he proposed that the continents, the continental drift thing, had once been joined and slowly drifted apart. And the geological establishment didn't just agree, they ridiculed him. And he died in 1930, still considered a crank by almost all in his field, until in the 1960s, a mountain of evidence finally came forth and proved that he was right all along. And all the mockers and all the scientists and all that whole generation, they were sure they were right, they were wrong. Of course, did they go back and apologize to the dead man? Of course they couldn't. Or his family? I'm sure they did not. I'm sure they never admitted it, any of them, in my opinion. It's just not our way. It's human nature. So to this day, people are still fighting that Africans did not build Africa, that people came in from outside. I want to get back to this Petrie, Sir, That's always scary when you see Sir. When you see Sir, they're in the club. Sir Flinders Petrie, one of the most respected archaeologists of his era, argued that Egyptian civilization wasn't built by the people living in Egypt or in Africa, and that a wave of invaders from outside brought them writing, architecture, and religion. So Petrie himself personally walked back the specifics of his own theory by the late 1890s, once further digging convinced him that a rival had been right. But the broader idea that outsiders founded the unified Egyptian state got carried forward by other prominent Egyptologists after him and stayed part of mainstream thinking. Why? Because the colonial powers, this is my opinion, and if the colonial powers needed that, they needed Ham to be cursed, even though the Bible says Ham wasn't cursed. Canaan was cursed. Ham was never cursed, but they had to have the blacks for colonial period to steal their land, steal their wealth, steal everything. They had to have this narrative. And how could you have the top nations in the world 3,000, 4,000 years ago being run by black Africans? That's what it against. They couldn't go there. So this narrative from Petrie, even from the late 1800s, all the way through, they were still holding on to that in the 1960s. There's still people holding on to that today. Absolutely. If you look at Moreau or Great Zimbabwe, you can find people absolutely that say, no, that wasn't built by Africans. That was others that came in and conquered the land and then left, and we don't have any. They can't have it be that the African people were the top, nation builders in the world at the time of Ham, Cush, Put, Canaan, all those people. They can't have those things because it goes against the narrative. It goes against the narrative that while Egypt run by blacks and Moreau and Cush run by blacks and all the other areas, they couldn't have that while the Europeans were living in, they weren't living in castles back then, let me put it that way. So the door broke open, but it was grudging, super grudging. As I said, it's still not open. I want to talk about why these things hold on so long. Because once, as I said, science is almost like a religion in many ways. People are human, and the people that are in it have their reasons, their money, and their power, and their university placements, and their papers, and their scholarship. And it's very hard to turn that ship, very hard. They'll even, in a sense, make up evidence or hide evidence that goes against the grain. I'm going to do some videos on the American continent as well, because the same thing exactly happened there. They literally hid away things. They hid 9-foot, 10-foot skeletons, took them away. They're all buried in the Smithsonian or someplace. They hid it because it can't go with the narrative. If the narrative is that these people are uncivilized, uncouth, we can then go take their land because they need us, right? That's the colonial attitude. But if it shows that they are actually were more advanced, they're the ones that started mathematics, they're the ones that started the written languages, they're the ones that started the great city-states, and then you go, what are we doing down here telling them that we should actually come down and learn from them? So papers that challenge the foundation of science are harder to publish, absolutely. If you even took a TV show today or a movie, and you made the Ten Commandments movie, for instance, and you have a Moses who's black, and the Pharaoh who's black, and the Pharaoh's sister and his daughter, and everybody in the whole movie are black Africans. Would that be accepted by the people in our day? It wouldn't even be accepted by a lot of African American or African people, because, like I said, we have on these colonial blinders, and it's very, very hard, very hard. And as I do these videos, it just makes me realize just how indoctrinated I was about so many things. No one's doing it on purpose, and it's not casting blame per se. We grow into these things. It's just the belief we have. I look at some of and to give you an idea of this, I look at the contention I see in my comments among the Igbo and the Yoruba and the Bantu as to who is the right group and who did this to this person, that. Things go back. Things take a long time, and unraveling these things takes a long time, but we don't change our attitudes very easily, and nor do the scholars. So it doesn't have to be quite a conspiracy theory, although I do believe there was absolutely a lot of that as well. It's just that any specialized institution, what they do, once it has momentum, once an idea has momentum, that's what's run with. And no matter what comes in saying, have you thought of this or that? No, it gets run over, put aside, it's not listened to. The philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, had a name for this. Normal science is puzzle solving inside an accepted framework. And it takes a real pileup of anomalies before anyone's willing to question the framework itself, because questioning it is expensive professionally and personally. And Diop paid nearly his whole career's worth of that cost alone before the field was willing to even argue with him, not agree with him, to even speak to him. 40, 50, 60 years, that's a long time. And I hope that we will all, and I know you do, give great credence to this man, incredible perseverance. I alluded to this, I think it's worth talking about one more time, that it takes time for the scholars to change and for Diop to win his arguments, or at least get people talking and all that kind of thing, or for the Piltdown man, or for this dynastic race colonial ideas. They take time, and then when they fall apart, okay, we can say, oh yeah, we don't believe that anymore. But then the cultural clock is another clock. So we have the scholar scientific clock. It may change over time, but what they have then taught the public in movies that have been made and books that have been made, the public's mind takes a much longer time to change, if they ever do change, because the culture clock is a very different animal, if you want to call it, entirely. And I talked about the Hollywood, I'm not going to get into that, but the point is, even now, if you did that, the scholars and the Egyptologists might say, yeah, that's okay to have African people acting in those roles. But with the culture, whether in Africa or Europe or America, Brazil, China, would they accept having a complete change in the actors? They would think they would be furious, right? You're pulling a fast one on us. What are you trying to do? This is, that kind of thing. So what's the lesson here? In my opinion, it's not to trust every idea. And I try to say this in all my videos. Please use what I give and help you to find, whether it be other channels or other ideas. They're just ideas. There's no proof. I have no proof of where Jerusalem is, or the Jordan River, or where the original Sea of Galilee was. I don't have the proof. I don't have a proof where David had this battle, or where he was crowned, or I don't have that proof. I believe one day we'll have it, but I don't have it. So what we put out there, we need to put out to think about, to consider it. And that's what the beauty of this. It gets back to what the Savior said. He didn't come and tell everybody everything. He hardly told them anything. He told them the bare minimum. And he wept because he couldn't give them more, because they weren't ready. So he talked in parables and that kind of thing. And he was a little more straightforward with his apostles, who were a little more prepared. But even with them, he said, other sheep I have which are not of this fold. He said, them also I must visit. But did they ask him, where are the lost tribes? Not that we know of. Okay, so he didn't tell them because they didn't ask. And if the same for us. If we don't ask the Father and search and seek and ask, we probably aren't going to find, because we don't put the effort into it. But Diop, he put the effort in. Not that he just had the theory which was right. He spent the time getting actual evidence that proved his theory, until finally he was able to move a few minds. But if we can learn ourselves that we need to study these things out ourselves, and yes, all that we can, but it's in the seeking, it's in the finding, it's in the searching, that we can draw closer to the Father, and we can learn truth for ourselves. And if we do it with the Father, by keeping all the commandments, then we can ask the Father to be our guide and help us to come into all truth. Truths that are only for us personally, and truths that we can share with others. But how can we come into truth if we don't come to the person that actually has all the truth? Yes, we can do all the studies and all the books and watch all the YouTubes and all that, and that's all great. But in the end, if we really want to come to the truth, I think we have to come to the Father. But what he did, he built a way for people to check his work, to go through. I try to do it best I can with my videos as well. I try to give you different. When I did the one on the Jordan River, I tried to use every piece I could find that spoke about the Jordan River in the Bible. Because I can't go back and talk to someone 3,000 years ago and find out where the Jordan was when they lost their axe head. But so all I can do is say, have you considered this? Let's look at this river. Does it have this feature? Does it have that feature? Is it large enough? Is it small enough? That's all we can do and try to work out a theory. But once we have a theory, at some point we have to take the theory into fact. And as long, in my opinion, as no one is digging in the earth in Kenya and South Africa, as long as the colonial powers rule even through their African friends that take the power too, as long as that's happening, I don't see that there's going to be a lot of the actual finding of places with actual proof very easily, because there is a lot of power in the world that doesn't want the ancient peoples of the Bible to find their own land either. So no matter what you find in my videos on my channel, please understand that I do respect that. Each of us have our own path, and each of us are finding our own truth in, I do believe there's only one truth, and how we come at it, and I mean there's thousands and millions of facets of truth, of course. How we come at it, that's up between us and our Father in heaven. But if I put something out there, it is for being considered, not for, I know this for a fact, right? I know that Jerusalem is in Namibia, or I know it's here in South Africa, or I know it's right here on Mount Kenya, or I know it's here in Aksum, or here in Ethiopia, or I don't know. And until we put a shovel in the ground or come up with a way of proving it like Diop did, I don't think that we can know. But we certainly can speculate and think and use our noggins and break these blinders we have little by little, so we can flee Babylon. We can see what Babylon, part of the colonial powers that rule the world, but it's all the rulers of the world. We can flee Babylon, but we can first see it and start to break those chains with which we're bound. Anyway, I just did this video. I think you might enjoy it. And here's another video you might enjoy. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, and take care. Have a good day. Bye-bye.